Thank you, Mrs. Vice President. Excellencies, dear colleagues, it is an honor to present the annual report of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. My daddy changed the world. Those were the words of George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter in 2020, after the murder of her father by the police, which led to global anti-racism protests amid a global pandemic to demand justice and an end to systemic racism. 4 years later, and we are forced to reckon with an erosion of the momentum built during the 2020 movement, despite some gains. We find ourselves still confronting the same harrowing realities of people of African descent, being disproportionately killed in the context of encounters with law enforcement and subjected to deadly violence during migration. We are seeing new waves of racism on social media, racist hate speech from politicians, and a disturbing use of racially biased artificial intelligence systems in the dispensation of justice, amongst others. Without an unequivocal and proactive anti-racist approach, we stand to lose critical ground in the ongoing fight against systemic racism. It is for these reasons that we call for the proclamation of a second international decade for people of African descent with a decolonial approach. This next international decade must tackle systemic and structural racism within and among countries, pursue reparatory justice, and address emerging and urgent challenges such as climate and environmental justice and the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, as highlighted by the UN Secretary General in his latest report on the International Decade for People of African Descent. The establishment of this permanent forum on people of African descent and the elaboration of the draft United Nations Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent are one of the most significant outcomes of the first international decade. As we move forward, the Permanent Forum envisions the second international decade as the catalyst for this declaration's adoption, serving as a critical stepping stone towards an eventual international convention focused on states' obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of people of African descent. Mrs. Vice President, as the largest platform within the United Nations for people of African descent, attracting more than 1,000 participants from more than 100 countries in its third session, the Permanent Forum is committed to the pursuance of equity for all people of African descent. During the reporting period, the Permanent Forum has engaged with member states, regional organizations, representatives of civil society, including youth representatives, United Nations experts, agencies, funds and programs, and the private sector from around the world. Through our work, we have sought to contribute to amplifying the voices and aspirations of people of African descent, whether it is in the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the promotion and full respect of the human rights of people of African descent, for the implementation of the International Decade for People of African Descent, or in other international processes related to sustainable development, climate justice, and reparations. The Permanent Forum has put forward various key recommendations to further the rights of people of African descent. Allow me to start with those focused on education and culture. The Permanent Forum views education as the cornerstone for building just, non-discriminatory, and inclusive societies. To truly serve this purpose, education must be anti-racist, civil, inclusive, and with curricula that accurately reflects the histories, cultures, contributions, and agency of people of African descent. There are several governments and grassroots initiatives aimed at promoting anti-racist education, such as the enactment of equal treatment and non-discrimination laws, the implementation of affirmative action measures, the creation of community educational programs to preserve ancestral practices and languages, and the development of educational programs for women and girls. Yet, much more remains to be done. Member states need to step up their efforts to guarantee the right to equality education for people of African descent and to dismantle systemic and structural racism within the education systems, including by taking special measures for socio-economically challenged communities of African descent, by introducing alternative measures to policing in educational settings, and by including in the curricula comprehensive teaching of the global impacts of colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, and genocide. This education should not be limited to schools. Truthful and comprehensive public awareness raising needs to be ensured, and continued promotion of cultural diversity and inclusivity needs to be strengthened as part of recognition efforts for people of African descent. There is indeed an extensive, diverse, and rich cultural heritage of communities of African descent, yet it is deplorable that people of African descent are often discriminated against for celebrating and embracing their cultural heritage. This extends to their religions, beliefs, and spiritual practices, which have faced discrimination and erasure. Member states must take decisive steps to protect and preserve African and people of African descent spiritual and traditional practices, as well as ancestral lands, territories, and monuments. It is our hope that member states will leverage the forthcoming United Nations Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent to secure protection and preservation in this regard. Mrs. Vice President, realizing equality within and among countries is a central tenet of the 2030 Agenda. However, there are entrenched structural inequalities in the global economy, rooted in histories and legacies of colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, and genocide. Adverse and destructive effects of climate change are also attributable primarily to the historical emissions, economic activities, and consumption patterns of the global north, while disproportionately affecting countries and people in the global south, including Africans and people of African descent. To achieve the 2030 Agenda without leaving Africans and people of African descent behind, member states need to take comprehensive measures to address socio-economic inequalities faced by people of African descent in their countries, such as promoting ownership, access to sustainable clean water, financial assistance for affordable housing, entrepreneurial empowerment, employment opportunities, microfinancing institutions, and economic models that serve to empower people of African descent, such as social and solidarity economics and cooperatives. At the global level, member states need to take further steps to bridge the gaps between countries in the global south and the global north, including by promoting equitable participation for Africans and people of African descent in international governance. As anti-racism human rights mechanisms, we have often stressed there is a need to address the past in order to secure future conditions of life that uphold the dignity and rights of all. In that regard, the Permanent Forum's work is grounded in the full and effective implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and the identification and analysis of best practices, challenges, opportunities, and initiatives to address as appropriate the issues highlighted in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action relevant to people of African descent, including on reparatory justice. Reparatory justice in all its dimensions plays an integral role in addressing histories and legacies for the accomplishment of sustainable development for Africans and people of African descent. And it should also be included in the United Nations Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent and the Second International Decade for People of African Descent. I note and welcome the African Union decision from its last summit meeting requesting the Permanent Forum to collaborate with the African Union to organize an international meeting involving former and current colonial powers on the issues of reparations for acknowledgement and healing with regard to the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans, colonialism, and apartheid. Allow me to add that reparations is not only a global effort. The establishment of independent national, regional, and local reparatory committees and task forces to study and promote reparatory justice for people of African descent is needed. Finally, we cannot talk about reparations without addressing the situation of Haiti. The Permanent Forum is distraught by the impact that the legacy of colonization and the institution of enslavement have had in this country. We will soon launch a position paper highlighting the links between Haiti's history and today's ongoing, unabated humanitarian, political, security, and human rights crisis in the country. We call on this Council to continue to prioritize Haiti on its agenda, including by holding a discussion specific to the linkages between the past and present human rights challenges in Haiti. Mrs. Vice President, dear delegates, allow me to conclude by saying that in a world where racism and racial discrimination is entrenched in every aspect of our lives, the fight for equality must be constant. It must be today, it must be tomorrow, and it must be throughout the second decade and beyond. As stated by Abraham Kendi, and I quote, "One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confront racial inequalities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of non-racist. The claim of non-racist neutrality is a mask of racism." I thank you.